is to go to the next one. We are talking about the Gilded Age, or really we're talking about something that goes beyond the Gilded Age, well into the New Deal period. We're not going to talk about World War II, but the lead up to World War II is going to be important in the preparation for the New Deal. Let's just talk real quick about what our methodology was. We talked about this for the first 5 minutes or so last time. We're trying to remember that this is not a course about American history, or to teach you American history, 40 minutes, 30 minutes isn't enough to cover this amount of time. It's really a course about teaching history, as in the philosophy of doing history, and specifically the philosophy of doing history in a Marxist sense, or in a historical materialist sense. I like covering long span periods because it encourages us not to think of history as these discrete events that happen, but rather as this large fabric or continuous motion that keeps happening and keeps affecting subsequent generations. And so what we're going to talk about 70 or 80 years here, realistically, that's only one person's lifespan. There's plenty of people, thousands, millions of people who lived through this entire time period, and so would have had conscious memories of everything that happened before that, whose parents would have had conscious memories of everything that happened before that, and whose kids, therefore, would have had conscious memories of what happened here. So in my opinion, if we want to talk about what's happening in 2026 America, it's not at all ridiculous to start in the 1870s. Not at all. What are our learning goals for today? Basically, we want to talk about the major changes in American society between the Civil War and World War II. So first, we're going to have to talk about the ending of Manifest Destiny, the closing of the West, as we call it, the end of the Indian Wars. That is really important when we talk about the maturation of American capitalism across the entire continent and not in just little pockets. We're going to talk about mass European migration that happens. Over 30 or 40 million Europeans migrate into the Americas from the 1870s until 1910 or so. A crazy amount of people, especially for this amount of time. We're going to talk about the maturation of capitalism. That means the vast majority of people are going to be living in cities. They're going to be urban dwellers. And those major changes are going to create some new politics. Number one, there's going to be a new form of working class politics. The vast majority of people are now going to be proletarian workers. They're going to be working in factories, working in industry of some kind, not farmers. That's radically different in human history, world history. It's also radically different in American history. And along with that comes this new liberal urban bourgeoisie, and specifically middle class, that has their own political desires and movement, and we call that the social progressive era. And then at the end of the 1920s or so, there's going to be a massive crisis in the Great Depression, and that's going to force these two components to work together. And that's what we call the New Deal coalition, or the Popular Front of the 1930s. So, to begin, by the way, a lot of extra information is going to be found on these session guides that we have, a lot of reading recommendations. I'm going to just try to go through them all because I don't want this to take too long. Okay, to begin, we talked about the Homestead Act last time. We talked about how the Republican Party ran on the Homestead Act as a major impetus for continuing to settle the West, specifically for northern farmers and not for southern slavers. We talked about that as a major impetus for the Civil War. So that continues, and that becomes a major Republican policy of sending white settlers to the West. In 1871, Congress passes the Indian Appropriation Act that officially ends the federal government's sovereign treaty-making decisions with native tribes. What that means is from this point forward, the federal government is going to consider all tribes as wards of the federal government, not sovereign entities that we need to make treaties with, but rather things that the federal government needs to protect in some way or ward. The final two major Indian wars that we deal with in this period are the Red River War, which is majorly fought here in southern Oklahoma and Texas, and then the Black Hills War in Dakota. The Black Hills War famously ends in the Battle of Little Bighorn, with Custer and all that kind of stuff. These are the final large-scale conflicts that the Union military has with native tribes, but to be honest, a lot of small-scale wars, battles, skirmishes are going to continue in California, in New Mexico, in Oklahoma, well into the early 1900s. So it's another one of those things of trying to remember history as this continuous thing that doesn't really stop or end at one moment. So what we're trying to get across here is that in this time period, from the 1860s to the 1930s, the tribal nations on American soil, or on United States soil, excuse me, are going to change their relationship drastically with the federal government. We call this time period the assimilation time period, right? I'm certain you've all heard about the practice of boarding school and stuff like that. The major characteristic, I would say, for how we describe this relationship is one of forced capitalization and forced industrialization in a way, or westernization, whatever you want to call it. Basically, many different tribal nations are going to interact with the federal government over these next 7 years in different ways. Some of them are going to assimilate more, some of them are going to assimilate less. But in every single case, all of them are going to be subject to these larger, broad trends in American society, meaning there's going to be thousands and thousands, millions of Native Americans moving into cities and becoming Native workers. This is how a lot of the Native demographics in places like Minneapolis are formed, where a lot of those urban working class are made in like the 1920s, 1930s, this time period. At the same time, we're going to see through the Dawes Act, 1887, tribal land, which is still, at this time, still considered owned by the tribal nations, is going to be regulated in such a way that parcels of land can only be owned and controlled by individual heads of households, male heads of households, which is a new instance in Native society, at least for the vast majority of Native societies. So I would call this the process of creating private property relations, specifically nuclear family-based private property relations on Native land. A massive part of especially the late 1800s and early 1900s. A kind of reaction to this whole thing is something we call the Ghost Dance movement, which is a spiritual literary movement with Native people, especially in the early 1890s, mainly based around cultural revival of some kind. And when the federal government tries to tamp it down, that ends in the massacre of Wounded Knee. In 1924, officially all Native Americans are given citizenship. It's called the Indian Citizenship Act. That's another one of those like final moments of just bringing in an externally colonized people into a fully internally colonized force or population. And then finally, this period ends in the Indian Reorganization Act. This is also known as the Indian New Deal. And specifically, what's important to get is that it's led by people like these men in these photos who are overwhelmingly natives of different tribes. So they're not of any one specific tribe. They're the beginning of something called Pan-Indianism. And they're all going to be boarding school educated. These are a bunch of people from the Carlisle boarding school and founders of the National Congress of American Indians, still the largest Indian civil rights movement in the country. And these are the kind of guys who are going to control Native politics for the 20th century, for better or for worse. There's going to be a lot of different conflicts that come up because of this. Okay, so at the exact same time that this is happening, and I want you to notice this movement of people changing classes, from becoming working class, from being rural to being working class people in cities, from being maybe land owning people to becoming middle class people who are professors, who are intellectuals, who are whatever. This is this new middle class, which is going to really drive forward politics in lots of ways. So that middle class is going to have a specific kind of progressive politics, and liberal progressive politics. The first instance we can see of this is the Pendleton Civil Service Act. That's just about making federal appointments in jobs actually merit-based. Before that, many of these jobs are determined by feudalistic relationships, basically. You know, whose uncle, whose nephew does this, and then if I do this, my second cousin will get a journeyman apprenticeship with this master worker, and then this will happen, and therefore I get to be the customs collector for the state of New York. Stuff like that. And if you think about it from the middle class perspective, people who are very, very precarious in their situation, who are educated and who are trying to move up in the world, this is like the worst case scenario, because what they want is they want their education, the idea of a liberal technocracy, of a merit-based society to flourish, and they're the ones who really create this conception. So a lot of the politics of this period dives into increasing concepts of direct democracy, and this is where a lot of electoral reforms happen. The first time that there are citizen referendums, for example, happens in this time period. We'll talk about the constitutional amendments in a second, but this is when senators become elected by direct vote instead of by the state legislatures. One major part of the progressive era politics of this time period is, something we kind of collectively call the social gospel. I would call it a form of Christian moralism, or maybe Christian socialism, humanitarian Christianity, or whatever. Heavily guided by Protestant Christian principles. But really, what I want you to get is that it's a massive reaction to the effects of industrialization. When you now see this new urban class living in cities, you see mass poverty, you see a kind of wealth disparity between people in these cities. It leads this kind of religious upheaval to end child labor laws, to do this, to talk about environmental concerns, and to talk about meat packaging and all this kind of stuff, right? So I'm just trying to get across that this is a new kind of politics that's coming about, specifically from these people, mainly Protestant people, mainly from the Republican Party, because as we'll talk about, there are massive ethnic differences happening at this time. A part of this Christian moralism is the temperance movement, which is absolutely massive in the late 19th centuries and early 20th centuries. We really have to understand this as a form of ethnic conflict in American society, I would say. The temperance movement was most fervent and most influential in Republican states, specifically states with large Anglo-Saxon and white Protestant populations, who saw alcohol and the temptations of alcohol, and specifically the massive spikes, or let's say the creation of alcoholism as a psychological, as a mental category, in this medical category. In this time period, they see this as a result of immigration, specifically immigration from Southern Europe, Italy, Poland, Greece, the Balkans, places with Catholic populations. And we have to talk about European history to talk about why there's lots and lots of animosity between Protestants and Catholics at this time period. But you can imagine, just think about Protestants and Catholics hating each other, I would say as much or more than like the farthest right-wing Christians hate Muslims or whatever today. That's how much the animosity is at this time period between Protestants and Catholics. So that's going to be a major impetus behind that temperance movement. Some other things that are going to happen, right? There's this massive pushback against the centralization of capital. There's so much new money coming into the society, and so much of it is being accumulated at the very top of that society. And so these social progressives see that that's a problem, and they're trying to find ways to reform around this. And so that's where a lot of our anti-monopoly acts come from: the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act. Finally, this is also the time period where a lot of the skeletons of the civil rights movement at large is formed. The NAACP is formed, the National, I can't speak right now, I'm not even attempted. In 1909, actually I'm gonna have a drink of water. I was sick last week. So, the NAACP is formed in 1909 by a bunch of different black middle-class reformers. W.B. Du Bois was a part of that founding, and it goes through many different interpretations and different iterations. Everything here is going to evolve and change over 80 years, right? What I really want to get across is the fact that this is fundamentally different than what everybody was dealing with 40 or 50 years ago. People were not, the major way people were organizing themselves politically was not to create these civil rights organizations, and not to do this not by having a bunch of lawyers get together and try to do stuff, right? That's a very new form of middle class organizing that is unique to a developed stage of capitalism. And that's what we really want to get across at this time period. So some of the major constitutional amendments of this time period. First is the federal income tax, and we can think of this as really the end of or the completion of the Republican federal processes of the Civil War, right? So we talked about Lincoln and the Lincolnite form of Republican federalism last time. A hugely expanded federal government. During the Civil War, the first ever federal income tax is instituted, and it takes 50, 60 years or so on to actually get that approved again into the Constitution. But that kind of just tells us about how long these things take. But also about the fact that functionally it was already there. right? It's not like the income taxes went away everywhere, though they did in many, many, many states. The point we're trying to get across here is that the capitalist state, or like the liberal democratic state that is formed after the Civil War, is trying to reach a mature development, trying to get to the level of bureaucracy we see in the mid-20th century. And part of that is having a really efficient and broad taxation system. A big part of this social progressive movement is to do away with some of the anti-democratic things in the Constitution. For example, in the original Constitution, and until 1913, all senators were elected not by direct popular vote, but by state legislatures, which was an easy way to get away with corruption, and a massively, massively hated part of the Constitution, especially by the lower classes, because it was intentionally placed into the Constitution as a mechanism to stop lower class influence on democracy. So the 18th Amendment is passes in 1919, is the abolition, or sorry, not the abolition, the Prohibition Amendment. And it's really seen, it should really be seen as part of the 19th Amendment as well, as this final victory for specifically women's groups women's Protestant groups in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Temperance was absolutely seen as a women's rights issues in many, many parts of the country I mean, it's hard to go into everything, right? But basically, you have a massive, massive, massive amount of alcoholism at this time period, where especially men, working class men, are drinking like crazy, and a lot of this is being, how do I say, a lot of the crisis in domestic violence, infanticide, femicide in working class families, not just working class families, all families across the United States, is being blamed on this alcoholism, and that is in itself coming into conflict with these, ethnicity questions we raised earlier, where we have working class feminists who are not for prohibition and are much more involved in the communist side of politics. But we can also say that a lot of that is because those working class women are coming from Italian families, who are coming from Spanish families, who are coming from a completely different cultural mindset, and they have a different, not a cultural mindset, I just mean that they are not, they do not benefit, let's say, from a hysterical attack against Catholicism in the United States, which is really what's happening if you look at the media, if you look at the cultural hegemony of how people are experiencing this. They're experiencing this as a form of, as the scaremonger campaign against Catholics in particular. And obviously, this period is the final push for the 19th Amendment, which establishes women's suffrage for all women over the age of 21. I always specify 21 because it's not until around the early 1970s until all people over the age of 18 can vote. This is a really long held fight, and it goes hand in hand with temperance, because a big part of what convinces many white Protestant males in particular to vote for temperance or to vote for this amendment is because they believe that this is the way we can keep the temperance amendment in. This is the way we can keep this Protestant domination over the society over, again, a time period where like 40 million Southern Europeans have entered into the state, and there's massive fears over immigration. Okay, so we talked about the new kind of politics that the social progressive era has made, and we talked about that that's really coming from this liberal democratic impulse of the middle classes. But at the same time, there's a massive expansion of the working class, and specifically the industrial proletarian class in this time period. That happened before the Civil War. It started before the Civil War. But we can say, but this is when the majority of Americans are now working class people. And we can see the immediate conflicts of that come around the first time there's a crisis. So the first ever real international crisis in capitalism is the Panic of 1873. Which happens for many various reasons. There's a lot of complex geopolitical things happening in Europe. There's the Franco-Prussian War. At the exact same time, the German Empire is formed. At the exact same time, the state of Italy is formed for the first time ever. And in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War, after Paris is captured by the German army, the Paris Commune happens for 3 months, where workers rise up and take control over the entire city. And after 3 months, the Prussian army comes in and massacres everybody. So basically what I'm trying to say is that this is an international society we're dealing with. Everybody can talk to each other. Everybody knows what's happening. And specifically, this is an internationalist collapse. An economic collapse in Britain will intimately affect your finances if you live in Wisconsin. in the 1870s or the 1880s. And that is fundamentally new, very new in human history, very new in world history, and none of the people who lived through it would have had experience dealing with it. And they would have been very, very shocked. They wouldn't understand, why is my life so dependent on the market? A market that is controlled by capitalists, by the richest people on planet Earth. So, as a part of the Panic of 1873, in America, some of the largest and most violent labor struggles start. There's the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. The Panic of 1873, which leads to the long depression of the 1870s, is in large part caused by an over-speculation, a crisis of overproduction in the railroad and steel industries. The railroad industry was the second largest employer in the country behind just agriculture. So there's farmers and then there's rail workers. And massive amounts of them get laid off. The strike itself comes out after the boss is trying to cut wages for like the 4th time in 2 years. And that leads to 100 people dead, you could call it the first national strike in American history. And it's one of those times when the federal government, controlled by the Republican Party that we talked about last year as taking control over the federal government and really representing those financial interests in the North, having full control over the federal government, and specifically fearing that Paris Commune event, right? That specter of communism that Marx talks about in the Communist Manifesto across Europe is really at its height right now. As a part of this, these fears over normal citizens' complete reliance on the market, various different kinds of political forms and political parties form. Right? The first and the one that is the most, let's say, generalist in some way, and that lasts the least amount of time, is the Populist Party. The Populist Party wins elections across states. They win presidential electors. Colorado, Nebraska, places like this, they elect populist candidate electors for the electoral college, right? We hear about all these different policies they have. They want to get more silver to the economy, and none of us really understand why they want to do it. All their policies are about helping farmers, really. The vast majority of them are about helping farmers and about helping working class people across the United States. That's about nationalizing railroads. They want to do that. They want to bring more federal control over banks, over financial institutions, all this kind of stuff. So that's the Populist Party, but that quickly goes away, and it gets absorbed into what we call the William Jennings Bryan faction of the Democratic Party. So we talked about the Democratic Party being the bashing of slaveholders in the antebellum South, but over the late 19th century, because the Republican Party in particular takes the form as the party of capital, half of the Democratic Party, especially the Northern Democratic Party, is going to become the party of the working class. That's going to take a long time. But their major constituencies in that are going to be Irish Catholics in the North, in the cities, Italians in the North, in the cities, immigrant communities all over the place in the North, and specifically working class people, as well as farmers in the Midwest, farmers everywhere. So that section of the Democratic Party, specifically led by William Jennings Bryan, who loses 4 straight presidential elections despite being the candidate for the Democratic Party, they get absorbed into this section. And this section is really going to be the one that lays the groundwork for the Roosevelt era Democratic Party. But we're still living in a time period with full Republican control over the legislature, over the executive. And why? Because this entire society is controlled at the Capitol at this moment. This is let's say the political process, at least until now, in American history has never been so controlled by big business as it is in the 1870s and 1880s. So, along with the Populist Party rises the Socialist Parties, the Socialist Party of America, which is formed in the early 1900s. Before that, there's also the Socialist Labor Party, there's the Working Men's Party. All of these are parties of the working class, and they define themselves as that. We are not a party of the people. That's what the Populist Party says. We're a party of American people. We want the American people to have democracy. The Socialist Party, the IWW, the Communist Party says, no, we're not the party of the people. We're the party of the working class. And we have specific demands and specific priorities for the working class that cannot coexist with demands of other classes, of the middle class, of the bourgeoisie. And so we will elect our representatives on this basis, and we will organize on this basis. what's the difference between the Socialist Party and the IWW? The IWW is the International Working Men of the World. It's a much more radical formation, but specifically, let's say that its interest is organizing workers in unions and to establish those independent organs of political power in American society. And this is going to take a long time. For any semblance of a union movement to happen in American society, a lot of people are going to die, and it's going to take like 50 or 60 years to even get anywhere. The IWW also has a lot of major radical influence from Southern America, like we're talking, not Southern America, Southern Europe, like we're talking about. A lot of these people are like Italian anarchists. Anarchism is a huge deal in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Communists from France, from Germany, from Britain, all these people who are moving to America because usually they're fleeing persecution in Europe because they try to do a revolution there. And they're flocking to these new parties. Now, up until 1917, there's a very, let's say, steady understanding, let's say, with the American working class, that this is a white working class, number one. This is a working class that is largely opposed to immigration, though can be pro-immigration. They have weird nativist and non-nativist tendencies. It's a weird eclectic mash of things that are happening, right? But World War I in particular forces a massive crisis. This crisis is way bigger in Europe, and everybody here needs to know about that, and maybe we'll do a European history course about it, but we can't go into it. The important thing to get here is that the socialist parties of Europe and many of the socialists in America choose nationalism over internationalism. And they decide that we're gonna fight this war. We're gonna do this war, we're gonna fight through this war, even though millions of people are dying, and for no reason today, like our only cultural memory of World War I is how pointless it was. And it's gonna be the first industrial war, really, ever. It's gonna be horrifying for everybody. And it's gonna cause a massive split in this movement. Part of that split is the Bolshevik Revolution in Europe, and that's gonna create a whole new paradigm. One where many of the most radical people, especially the ones from Europe, especially the ones who are most discriminated against, who are the most marginalized in American society, are going to kind of band together and try to form a form of socialist internationalism in the Communist Party. The Communist Party is the first socialist party in the United States that's actually going to take seriously some form of internationalism, of being, race and colorblind, whatever that means, but of trying to organize people wherever they are. Okay. Most of us live in urban environments. That's not the case for the 19th century. And they are fundamentally changing their reality on the way because they have to go from here to there. They have to leave their homelands behind in a lot of cases. Again, 30 million Italians and Jews and Russians and Lithuanians come into this country at the exact same time. And again, on top of that, their lives are now totally and completely dependent on this market. Whether or not they get a job is dependent on what the market is doing. Whether or not they can afford food is dependent on what the market is doing. And they have no control over that. So the only control that they can find, at least the working classes will attempt to find, is control over their productive lives through unionization and through, hopefully, in many of their eyes, through revolutionary action and seizing capital themselves. Okay, so what are the key takeaways from this period? Okay, we talked about the Indian Wars, but what we really got to understand about that is, number one, capitalism has reached its final maturity. Well, not the final maturity, but maturity in the United States. Okay, it's completed its conquest of the American continent. It is going to transform in a way that the vast majority of people are going to be in urban environments. They're going to be working class people. They're not going to be farmers. At the same time, all this new urbanization, all this new wealth funds a completely different kind of middle class subject, a middle class political being, and that middle class being is going to be, if we think of Teddy Roosevelt, if we think of Woodrow Wilson, the great progressive kind of I don't want to call them great, but the big progressive people of this time, they're thinking of capitalism and industrialization as this great thing that comes with it comes with downsides, and we've gotta reform the downsides away. At the opposite time, there's another class who's actually the majority of people in this society who are so alienated from their labor that they actually really despise a lot of these social reforms because they're not real revolutionary solutions. A great example of this, I like to say, is that most of the working class organs of power in this country in the 1880s and 1890s are totally opposed to child labor laws. One, because a lot of times they see it as just a kind of way to ease the souls of not white, but just middle class reformers everywhere in the country. And two, because to them it's just money out of their pocket, of working class families. And what does it matter if my child doesn't go to school? Literally, our entire function in this society is to be exploited labor. Being a minor in the 1880s is, you might as well die. It's not a life worth living. And so at the very end of this entire situation, we get a massive crisis in capitalism. Something that we still have not seen again. And that crisis is the crisis that's going to lead to World War II. It's going to lead to fascism across Europe, and it's going to be enough of a crisis to get the middle class and parts of the bourgeoisie to forget how much they hate communism, and it's going to make the communists and the anarchists, maybe not the anarchists so much, but most of the socialists, to forget how much they hate the middle class and come together and create a popular front, do the New Deal. And in so creating the New Deal, they create the federal government as we know it today, the social democracy that we know today. Everything you can think about in the last 80 years is founded right here. This is the skeletons of everything that is destroying right now, crumbling, unraveling in front of our eyes. That is this outline of the last 80 years. Okay, that's enough. Let's all take a break. Get some water.